New Year's curse. The snow was falling heavily that night, wrapping the world in a suffocating silence. I had almost declined Lena's invitation to the New Year's Eve gathering, but something compelled me to go. Perhaps it was guilt. I hadn't seen her in years. Or perhaps it was curiosity. The house her husband had inherited was infamous in whispers I had heard growing up. They called it Crowthorne Manor, and tales of its long-dead owners were full of intrigue. Strange rituals, unexplained deaths, disappearances that left no trace. When I arrived, the mansion loomed over the icy landscape, its dark spires cutting into the night sky. The windows glimmered faintly, like watchful eyes. I knocked on the heavy oak door, and the sound echoed eerily before Lena herself pulled it open. She looked different. Her usually bright demeanor was muted, her smile a forced shadow of itself. Her eyes darted to the snow-covered driveway behind me, as if she were expecting someone or something to follow. "You're late," she said, her voice almost drowned out by the wind. "Traffic," I replied. "Bad storm." She nodded, ushering me inside without further small talk. The warmth of the house was stifling after the cold outside, and the air carried a peculiar scent. Old wood mingled with something metallic. The guests were scattered in small groups throughout the dimly lit parlor, their voices hushed. There was none of the festive cheer I had expected. Instead, the air felt heavy with an unspoken tension, as if everyone was holding their breath. Lena handed me a glass of champagne and gave me a tight smile. "Before we ring in the new year, there's something we do every year. Tradition," she said, gesturing toward a small table at the room's center. On it sat a polished wooden box, small but ornately carved. The carvings were grotesque faces, twisted in expressions of anguish or malice. My skin prickled as I stared at it. "This is the family heirloom," Lena explained. Her voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "Every year it's passed around at midnight, a little quirk of the family, something about luck for the coming year." Her explanation felt rehearsed, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as me. I reached for the box. It was unnaturally cold, and the moment my fingers touched its surface, a shiver ran up my spine. "Open it," Lena urged softly. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was an amulet, a tarnished silver pendant shaped like a coiled serpent, its eyes two tiny red stones. As I lifted it, the room seemed to grow darker, the faint hum of conversation dwindling to silence. The amulet was heavier than it looked, and the red stones glinted unnervingly under the flickering candlelight. "Beautiful," I murmured, though the word felt wrong in my mouth. As I passed the amulet to the next guest, I noticed Lena's husband watching from across the room, his face pale and drawn. His lips moved as though he were muttering a prayer, but his eyes were fixed on the amulet as if it were a venomous snake. Midnight came with a half-hearted countdown, the cheer hollow as champagne glasses clinked. When the amulet made its way back to the table, its tarnished surface seemed duller, its weight pressing heavily on the room's atmosphere. I lingered in the parlor, feeling restless as the other guests drifted away to quieter corners of the house. My hands felt icy despite the roaring fireplace. No amount of champagne seemed to settle my nerves. Lena found me staring at the box, unable to shake the sense that the faces carved into it were watching me. "It's just a silly tradition," she said, her voice low. "Silly isn't the word I'd use," I replied. Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as though she feared someone might overhear. "It's nothing to worry about. Everyone always gets like this the first time. You'll be fine." Her reassurance only deepened my unease. As she left, the silence of the room seemed alive, humming with an almost imperceptible vibration. The shadows cast by the fire danced unnaturally, their shapes contorting in ways that defied logic. When I finally made my way to the guest room, a sense of unease clung to me like cobwebs. I bolted the door and pulled the curtain shut, hoping to drown out the feeling of being watched. Exhaustion finally claimed me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke abruptly in the early hours, my heart pounding. The air in the room was freezing, and the faint sound of whispering tickled the edges of my hearing. I turned on the lamp, but the light seemed dim, swallowed by the darkness pressing in around me. That's when I saw it. The amulet was on my nightstand. I knew it hadn't been there before. I had left it downstairs with the box. But there it lay, its serpent coiled as though poised to strike, the red stones glinting like malicious eyes. A cold dread settled over me as the whispering grew louder, the language incomprehensible, but somehow full of menace. When I reached for the amulet, my hand recoiled as if burned. The thing felt alive, its presence oppressive and heavy, like the weight of unseen eyes. Sleep would not come again that night. The morning brought no relief. The storm outside had grown worse, trapping the guests in the manor, though no one seemed eager to leave anyway. Over breakfast, the tension was palpable. Lena's husband, Arthur, arrived late, his leg in a brace from a fall down the stairs. His demeanor was more subdued than ever, his eyes shadowed. I wanted to ask him about the amulet, why it had appeared in my room, why it seemed to radiate a malevolence that no one would speak of, but the words caught in my throat. The other guests avoided me, their gazes flicking nervously toward the parlor where the box still sat. As the hours dragged on, I found myself inexplicably drawn back to that cursed object. I stood in front of it, my reflection faintly visible in the glass doors of a nearby cabinet. The faces carved into the box seemed to mock me, their twisted expressions more grotesque in the daylight. "What is it you want from me?" I muttered under my breath. "It doesn't want you. It needs you." The voice startled me, and I turned to see Arthur standing in the doorway. He limped toward me, his face pale and gaunt. "I've been trying to tell Lena to stop this tradition for years," he said, lowering himself into a chair with a pained groan. "But the manor won't let us. Neither will the amulet." "What are you talking about?" My voice trembled. Arthur's eyes met mine, hollow and full of dread. "The amulet was forged centuries ago by one of my ancestors. He made a pact, a deal with something beyond this world. The details are murky, but the curse is clear. The amulet must be passed on each New Year's Eve. If it isn't, the misfortune spreads. First to the family, then to the guests, and finally to the world outside." I felt the blood drain from my face. "And the person who takes it?" Arthur looked away. "They're marked. For a year the curse follows them, gnaws at their soul, corrupts their luck. Then if they survive, they're free, until the next year." I staggered back, the weight of his words sinking in. "Why didn't Lena warn me?" "Because it's too late," Arthur said grimly. "Once you've touched it, you're chosen." Panic bubbled in my chest. I thought of the whispers in the night, the amulet appearing in my room, the oppressive presence that seemed to cling to me. I felt like a fly caught in a web, struggling against invisible strands that only tightened the more I moved. "Is there any way to end it?" I asked desperately. Arthur hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The journal in the library. It mentions a ritual, but no one has ever tried it. The risk is too great." "What risk?" "Failure," he said. "If you fail, the curse doesn't just take you. It consumes everyone in the manor." The library was cold and dim, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and leather. I searched frantically through the shelves, my hands trembling as I pulled out dusty volumes. Finally, I found it. A cracked leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was spidery and uneven, as if written in haste or fear. The entry about the amulet was brief, but chilling. The ritual must be performed before the final stroke of midnight. Speak the incantation to summon the keeper of the amulet. Present an offering of blood. If the keeper accepts, the curse may be contained for another year. If it does not, God have mercy on your soul. I read the instructions over and over, the words blurring together as my pulse pounded in my ears. An offering of blood? Did it mean a few drops or something more sinister? The journal mentioned a location, the manor's crypt, accessed through a hidden door in the cellar. My heart sank at the thought of descending into that dark, forgotten space, but I knew there was no other choice. As I made my way to the cellar, the house seemed to groan around me, the walls almost vibrating with a low, ominous hum. The other guests were nowhere to be seen, and even Lena and Arthur had vanished. I felt utterly alone, the weight of the curse pressing down on me with each step. The hidden door was easy to find, as if the house itself wanted me to proceed. Behind it, a narrow staircase spiraled down into the earth, the air growing colder with each step. My breath fogged in front of me, and the flickering flame of my lantern barely pierced the darkness. The crypt was a cavernous space, its walls lined with crumbling stone coffins. At the center stood an ancient altar, blackened with centuries of soot and blood. The amulet lay waiting, its red eyes glinting in the dim light. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to run. But the whispers returned, louder now, urging me forward. They spoke no language I understood, yet their meaning was clear. Come. Finish what has begun. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the altar. My hand trembled as I picked up the amulet, its cold surface sending a shock through my body. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows in the crypt seemed to come alive, swirling around me like a storm. I unsheathed a small knife and held it over my palm, hesitating for only a moment before slicing into my skin. Blood dripped onto the altar, and the shadows stilled, the air thick with anticipation. The final stroke of midnight was fast approaching, and I knew there was no turning back. The blood pooled on the altar, shimmering in the flickering lantern light. The crypt grew colder, the air sharp and biting as though every breath would freeze my lungs. The shadows, still and watchful, seemed to retreat, pressing against the walls like an audience waiting for a performance. The amulet grew heavier in my hand, and its red eyes burned brighter. Suddenly, the blood on the altar began to move, coiling and writhing like living tendrils. It sank into the cracks of the stone, vanishing as though the earth itself drank it. Then the keeper came. The room plunged into total darkness, the lantern's flame snuffed out by an invisible force. A sound like grinding stone echoed through the crypt, followed by a deep, guttural voice that resonated in my very bones. You dare summon me? A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and unnatural. It was neither man nor beast, but a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, its body writhing with the same anguished expressions carved into the box. Its eyes were hollow pits, yet I felt them boring into me, stripping away every layer of my being. I seek to end the curse, I managed to say, my voice trembling. The keeper laughed, a sound that scraped like knives across stone. End? The curse cannot end. It can only shift. A life for a life. A soul for a soul. I staggered back, the knife slipping from my blood-slick fingers. The keeper's shadowy form loomed closer, the stench of decay filling the air. Will you give what is required? It rasped. Or will you fail, as they all do? The journal's words flashed in my mind. God have mercy on your soul. I realized then what it meant, what the offering truly required. The blood I had spilled wasn't enough. The keeper demanded a life. Panic surged through me. I couldn't give what it wanted. I couldn't choose someone to die. Not Lena, not Arthur, not even myself. But the keeper was impatient. Its form swelled, its faces contorting in rage. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like icy chains. My breath caught as its voice thundered. Choose! The lantern flickered back to life, illuminating the room for just a moment. My reflection shimmered in the blade on the altar. My own face stared back, pale and wide-eyed, and I knew the answer. I gripped the knife, my hand steady now. Take me, I whispered. The keeper paused, its hollow eyes narrowing. Then it laughed again, the sound deafening as it swept forward to claim its due. The guests found the crypt the next morning, the altar cold and empty. The amulet was gone along with me, though no one dared question what had happened. Lena swore she saw me once, years later, through a frost-covered window. But it wasn't truly me. It was something wearing my face, watching from the shadows as another New Year's Eve began. The curse, it seemed, had not been broken. It had merely found a new keeper. Forever.